Dan Parker was a seasoned trucker, with 15 years of experience hauling loads across the country. He had driven through all kinds of weather, met strange people, and dealt with his fair share of unusual situations. But none of it compared to what he experienced one cold November night. That night, Dan was driving a refrigerated truck filled with frozen meat, heading from Nebraska to Chicago. It was late, and he had been on the road for hours. The radio was playing faint country music through a layer of static, and the occasional trucker's voice crackled through the CB radio. The last major town had faded in his rearview mirror, leaving him on a long, empty stretch of highway. The GPS chimed suddenly, breaking the monotony. Road closure ahead, rerouting. Dan glanced at the screen and frowned. The map showed a detour through a smaller road called Black Hollow Road. He sighed and followed the directions. Detours were a regular part of the job, and he didn't think twice about it. The new road was narrow and winding, with dense trees on either side. Their bare branches reached over the road like bony arms, almost forming a tunnel. A thick fog rolled in, swallowing his headlights and making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. Dan felt a chill creep up his spine. Something about the road felt wrong, but he brushed it off. "Just tired," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter. The fog, combined with the eerie silence of the woods, made the night feel heavier. The GPS showed a straight path, but in reality the road twisted and turned unpredictably. Dan slowed down, navigating carefully. As he drove deeper, his CB radio crackled to life. A faint, broken voice came through. "Turn, back." Dan frowned and adjusted the dial. "This is Truck 58, who's out there? Do you need help?" Static answered him. He waited, listening, but the voice didn't return. Shrugging it off as interference, he continued driving. A short while later, Dan spotted something ahead, a figure standing on the side of the road. As he got closer, he realized it was a woman. She was wearing a long, tattered coat, and her dark hair hung over her face. She had one arm outstretched, her thumb pointing up for a ride. Dan hesitated. He knew the trucker's code: help people when you can. But something about her unsettled him. She didn't move or step forward, just stood there like a statue. Dan slowed the truck to a crawl, rolling his window down slightly. "You all right, ma'am? Need a ride to the next town?" he called out. The woman didn't respond. She tilted her head slightly, her hair swaying in the wind. Dan leaned forward, trying to get a better look. Her face was partially hidden, but what he could see wasn't right. Her eyes were too wide, and her mouth looked stretched unnaturally, as though it had been split open. Dan's gut screamed at him to leave. He slammed on the gas, the truck roaring as it sped away. In his side mirror, he caught one last glimpse of her. She stood in the middle of the road, watching him, her head tilted unnaturally. His heart pounded as he gripped the wheel. The fog grew thicker, and the chill in the air seeped into the cab. Dan tried to shake off the encounter, telling himself it was just a strange hitchhiker, nothing more. But then he heard a soft knock. At first, he thought it was something shifting in the cargo hold. Then it came again, louder. It was coming from the back of the cab. Dan froze, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. He glanced in the mirrors but saw nothing. The knocking came again, followed by a voice. "Let me in, Dan." Dan's blood ran cold. The voice was clear, but he had no idea how the woman could have known his name. He slammed on the brakes, grabbed the tire iron from under his seat, and jumped out of the truck. He walked around the cab, shining his flashlight. The fog clung to everything, muffling sound and making the night feel heavier. He circled the truck, his breath visible in the cold air, but saw no one. After a few tense minutes, he climbed back into the cab and locked the doors. Again, he told himself it was all in his head. Maybe the long hours and lack of sleep were playing tricks on him, but just as he started to calm down, he saw another figure in the road ahead. This time, it was a man. He stood in the middle of the lane, wearing an old-fashioned suit and hat, like something out of the 1930s. Dan honked the horn, but the man didn't move. "Get out of the way!" Dan shouted, but the man just stood there, staring. Dan had no choice but to stop. He rolled down the window a crack. "What do you want?" The man tipped his hat and smiled. "You shouldn't be here," he said in a smooth, unsettling voice. "I'm just passing through," Dan replied, his voice shaky. The man stepped closer. "No one passes through Black Hollow Road." Before Dan could respond, the man vanished. 1 second he was there, and the next, he was gone. Dan didn't wait to find out what would happen next. He hit the gas, swerving around where the man had been standing. His heart pounded as he sped down the road, but his relief was short-lived. In the rearview mirror, he saw her again, the woman with the long, dark hair. She was standing in the middle of the road, her mouth stretched wide in a silent scream. The truck sputtered and groaned. Without warning, the engine died, and the truck rolled to a stop. Dan's hands trembled as he tried to restart it, but the engine wouldn't turn over. The fog grew thicker, wrapping around the truck like it was alive. Dan felt the air inside the cab grow heavy, almost suffocating. Figures began to emerge from the fog, one by one. Men, women, and children, all dressed in clothes from different decades. Their faces were pale, their eyes dark and empty. They surrounded the truck, pressing their hands against the windows. Dan locked the doors and screamed, "Get away!" but the figures didn't move. The last thing Dan saw before the windows shattered was the woman's face. Her wide eyes and twisted grin burned into his memory as everything went black. A week later, abandoned on Black Hollow Road. The cargo was untouched, but there was no sign of Dan. Locals whispered about the road, saying it was cursed. Tales of strange sightings and disappearances had been told for generations, but no one knew the truth. To this day, truckers avoid Black Hollow Road, and those who accidentally take it swear they've seen her, a woman with long dark hair, standing by the side of the road, waiting for her next ride. Sam Vickers was a trucker, known for taking jobs no one else wanted. He didn't mind long hours, bad weather, or isolated routes. If the pay was good, he'd take it. But one job, one cold autumn night, left a mark on him forever. The job seemed simple enough. Deliver a shipment of logging equipment to a remote town called Hollow Pines. Sam had never heard of it, but that wasn't unusual. He'd been to plenty of out-of-the-way places. The dispatcher warned him, though, the road was narrow, winding, and poorly marked. "Shouldn't be a problem," Sam had said confidently. The drive started easy. He'd left the main highway around dusk, turning onto a gravel road. The GPS showed Hollow Pines was about 50 miles ahead, but after a few miles, the map stopped updating. Sam tapped the screen. "Figures," he muttered. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest thickened on either side of the road. The trees were tall and black against the fading light, their branches clawing at the sky. Sam turned on his high beams, but the road seemed to get darker anyway, like the trees were swallowing them. 30 miles in, the radio started to act up. Static replaced the country music he'd been listening to, and every now and then, faint voices crackled through, too faint to make out words. Sam adjusted the dial, but nothing improved. The silence was worse than the static, so he left it on. The first real sign of trouble came when he noticed the mile markers weren't adding up. The markers on the side of the road suggested he'd driven 20 miles past where Hollow Pines should have been. But there was no sign of the town. No lights, no turnoffs, nothing. "Probably missed it," Sam muttered, though doubt crept into his voice. He decided to keep going, hoping the next turnoff would lead him back on track. The fog rolled in without warning, thick and white like smoke. Sam slowed the truck to a crawl. His headlights barely pierced the dense mist, and the road ahead was nothing but a shadowy outline. That's when he saw it. A man was standing in the middle of the road, motionless. He wore a flannel shirt and jeans, and his arms hung limp at his sides. Sam hit the brakes, the truck screeching to a stop just feet from the man. Rolling down the window, Sam leaned out. "Hey, you all right?" The man didn't move. Sam squinted. The man's head seemed off. It was tilted too far to one side, like his neck couldn't hold it up. The longer Sam stared, the more wrong it looked, as if his head wasn't attached properly. "Sir, you need to move," Sam shouted. Without warning, the man's head jerked upright, snapping into place with an audible crack. He looked directly at Sam, his eyes dark and hollow, and opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. Sam didn't wait. He slammed the truck into gear and swerved around the man, his tires skidding on the gravel. As he sped away, he checked the rearview mirror, but the man was gone. The road seemed endless now. Sam was sure he'd been driving for hours, but the trees and fog looked the same as they had miles ago. He checked his phone, but there was no signal. The GPS was still frozen, showing the truck sitting in one place. The silence pressed in on him. Even the radio was dead now, just a low hum of static. Then, a noise broke through the silence, a loud bang, like something hitting the side of the truck. Sam gripped the wheel tighter. The bang came again, followed by a scraping sound as if something sharp was being dragged along the metal. Heart racing, Sam pulled over and grabbed the crowbar he kept under the seat. Stepping out of the cab, he shined his flashlight along the side of the truck. Deep gouges ran the length of the trailer, like claw marks. "Who's out there?" Sam shouted, his voice echoing into the fog. There was no answer, but he felt it, a presence, watching him from the woods. The hair on the back of his neck stood up as he swung the flashlight beam across the trees. Shadows seemed to move just beyond the edge of the light, too fast to be animals. Sam climbed back into the cab, locking the doors. He didn't care what was out there. He just wanted to get out. As he started driving again, the fog thickened, making it almost impossible to see. Sam leaned forward, gripping the wheel tightly. He didn't notice at first, but the trees were changing. Their trunks were gnarled, twisted like they'd been frozen mid-scream. The branches were no longer bare. They were covered in something dark and wet that glistened in the headlights. The road began to narrow, the trees closing in on either side. Sam's heart pounded as he realized the truck wouldn't fit much farther ahead. He stopped, staring at the path. That's when he heard it. A low, guttural growl, coming from the woods behind him. It wasn't an animal, he knew that much. It was too deep, too unnatural. The growl grew louder, joined by the sound of branches snapping and something heavy moving through the forest. Sam hit the gas, forcing the truck down the narrowing path. Branches scraped the sides, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. The growling was right behind him now. In the mirror, he caught glimpses of something massive moving through the fog, too fast for its size. He couldn't make out details, just dark, shifting shapes. The road suddenly opened up into a clearing. In the center stood a crumbling wooden sign, its faded letters barely legible, Hollow Pines. But the town wasn't there. Only ruins remained, collapsed buildings, overgrown with vines, and shattered windows staring like empty eyes. The truck sputtered, its engine dying. Sam slammed his fist on the dashboard, but the truck wouldn't start again. The growling stopped. For a moment there was silence. Then a voice came from the shadows. "Why did you come here?" Sam turned, but no one was there. The voice was low, raspy, and seemed to come from everywhere at once. The shadows around the clearing began to move, twisting and merging into shapes, human shapes. Men, women, and children, their faces pale and gaunt, emerged from the darkness. They surrounded the truck, their hollow eyes fixed on Sam. He locked the doors, his hands trembling. The figures didn't try to get in, they just stood there, staring. Then, in unison, they pointed to the woods behind him. Sam didn't want to look, but something compelled him. Turning slowly, he saw it. A massive creature, its body covered in black, glistening scales, stepped into the clearing. Its face was a grotesque mix of human and beast, with glowing red eyes and a maw full of jagged teeth. It let out a deafening roar, shaking the truck. The figures outside began to chant, their voices low and rhythmic, as if calling to the creature. Sam didn't think. He grabbed his crowbar and flung open the door, running toward the ruins. Behind him, the truck groaned as the creature tore into it. Sam didn't stop running until he reached the woods. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stop. To this day, Sam doesn't talk about what happened on the road to Hollow Pines. He was found wandering along a highway miles from where he should have been, his clothes torn and his face pale as a ghost. The truck was never recovered, and no one could find Hollow Pines on any map. But truckers who pass through the area sometimes report hearing a low growl in the distance or seeing red eyes staring at them from the woods. And those who dare to follow the old road never come back. Charlie Tate had been trucking for over 2 decades. He loved the open road, the solitude, and the sense of freedom it gave him. But even in all his years of driving, he'd never ventured onto Old Ash Road. It wasn't on purpose, most truckers avoided it. The road wasn't marked on modern maps, and locals told stories about strange happenings there. They said it was cursed, but Charlie didn't believe in curses. He believed in bad weather, bad luck, and bad drivers, things he could handle. One rainy night, he found himself behind schedule after a delivery mishap. The dispatcher suggested a shortcut to make up for lost time. "Take Old Ash Road," the dispatcher said. Charlie hesitated. "You sure? I've heard things about that road." "Just stories," the dispatcher said. "You'll save 2 hours. It's fine." Reluctantly, Charlie agreed. He told himself it was just another road, nothing to worry. The rain was relentless as he turned onto Old Ash Road. The pavement quickly gave way to a bumpy, uneven path, and his truck rattled with every pothole. Trees lined both sides of the road, their branches thick and tangled, blocking out what little moonlight broke through the rain clouds. The GPS didn't recognize the road, so Charlie relied on the dispatcher's instructions. "Straight for 30 miles, he muttered to himself. Easy enough. The rain hammered against the windshield, and the wipers struggled to keep up. Visibility was poor, but Charlie pressed on. After about 10 miles, the radio cut out, leaving only static. He fiddled with the knobs, but nothing worked. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of rain and the truck's engine. That's when he saw the lantern. At first, it was a faint flickering light in the distance. Charlie squinted, trying to make it out. It swayed gently, like someone was carrying it. As he got closer, the figure holding it came into view, a man in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, walking along the side of the road. Charlie slowed the truck and rolled down the window. "Need a ride?" he called out. The man stopped and turned toward him. His face was pale, almost glowing in the lantern's light, and his eyes were dark, unreadable. "Keep driving," the man said, in a low, gravelly voice. Charlie frowned. "You sure? It's pouring out here." The man didn't answer. He just turned and continued walking, the lantern's light fading into the darkness. Shrugging, Charlie rolled up the window and drove on. But the image of the man stuck with him. Something about him felt off. The road became rougher, the potholes deeper. Charlie swerved to avoid a large branch that had fallen into the road, muttering under his breath about the state of the place. The rain began to let up, but the fog rolled in thick and fast, clinging to the ground like... He checked the odometer. He should have been nearing the end of the road, but there was no sign of a turnoff or intersection. Worse, the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, straight as an arrow. That's when the lantern appeared again. This time, it was in the middle of the road, swaying back and forth. The same man stood behind it, motionless. Charlie slammed on the brakes, the truck skidding to a stop. "What the hell?" he muttered. He rolled down the window again. "Hey, I thought you didn't need a ride." The man didn't respond. Instead, he raised his free hand and pointed behind the truck. Charlie glanced in the rearview mirror, but saw nothing except the fog and the dark outline of trees. When he turned back to the man, he was gone. The lantern was still there, lying on the road, its flame flickering weakly. A chill ran down Charlie's spine. He pulled the truck forward slowly, driving around the lantern. As he passed it, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The fog thickened, and the truck's headlights barely cut through it. Charlie gripped the wheel tighter, his eyes scanning the road ahead. A shadow darted across the road. Charlie hit the brakes again, his heart pounding. "What now?" he muttered, leaning forward to peer into the fog. Something large moved just beyond the edge of the light. It wasn't a person or an animal. Its shape was too twisted, too unnatural. It slithered, its movements jerky and wrong. Charlie's instincts screamed at him to drive, but the truck wouldn't start. He twisted the key in the ignition, but the engine only sputtered. The shadow moved closer, its form becoming clearer. It was tall, with long, spindly limbs and a hunched back. Its face was a grotesque mask of jagged features, its eyes glowing faintly. Charlie grabbed the crowbar he kept under the seat and jumped out of the cab. The creature stopped, tilting its head as if studying him. "Get back!" Charlie shouted, holding the crowbar in front of him. The creature let out a low, guttural growl, its eyes narrowing. It lunged forward, faster than anything that size should have been able to move. Charlie swung the crowbar, but it passed through the creature as if it were made of smoke. The impact sent him stumbling backward, and he fell to the ground. The creature loomed over him, its form shifting and flickering like a glitching image. Just as it reached for him, a bright light cut through the fog. The lantern. The man in the coat stood behind it again, holding it high. The creature recoiled, letting out a piercing screech before dissolving into the fog. The man stepped forward, his lantern casting an eerie glow. "I told you to keep driving," he said. Charlie scrambled to his feet, his voice shaking. "What the hell was that?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he handed Charlie the lantern. "You'll need this. It's the only thing that will keep them." Before Charlie could respond, the man disappeared into the fog. Clutching the lantern, Charlie climbed back into the truck. This time, The engine roared to life without trouble. The rest of the road was eerily quiet. The fog thinned, and the rain stopped completely. When Charlie finally reached the main highway, he pulled over and sat in silence, his hands trembling. He looked at the lantern, its flame still burning steadily. He didn't know what it was or why it worked, but he knew one thing: he wasn't going back to Old Ash Road. And he never did. Other truckers sometimes talked about the road, about strange lights and shadows that moved in the fog. Charlie never joined those conversations, but he always kept the lantern in his cab, just in case. Eddie Brooks was a long-haul trucker, known for his reliability and willingness to drive the loneliest roads. He wasn't superstitious, not like some of his buddies who swapped ghost stories at truck stops. Eddie figured strange things only happened to people looking for trouble. One chilly November night, Eddie was hauling an empty trailer back to his company's hub after a long delivery. He was eager to get home and sleep in his own bed for the first time in a week. The dispatcher radioed in with a last-minute request. "Gotta pick up in Dry Creek," the dispatcher said. "Dry Creek?" Eddie frowned. "That's way out of the way. What's the cargo?" "Just some crates. Shouldn't take long to load." Eddie groaned but agreed. The pay was worth the inconvenience. He adjusted his route, turning onto Route 6, a narrow, winding road cutting through the mountains. It was late, and traffic was non-existent. The moon hung low, casting a cold, pale light over the dense forest. Eddie turned up the heat in the cab and sipped his coffee, hoping to shake off the creeping drowsiness. About 20 miles from Dry Creek, his headlights caught something on the side of the road. A car, its hazard lights blinking. As he slowed down, he saw a woman standing next to it, waving her arms. Eddie pulled over, rolling down the window. "Everything okay, ma'am?" She looked to be in her late 20s, bundled in a heavy coat and scarf. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with what looked like fear. "My car died," she said, her voice trembling. "Can you give me a ride to Dry Creek? It's just a few miles ahead." Eddie hesitated. He wasn't in the habit of picking up hitchhikers, but she looked genuinely distressed. "All right," he said. "Climb in." "Thank you," she said, climbing into the passenger seat. She kept her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes darting toward the trees lining the road. Eddie tried to make small talk. "Rough night for car trouble." She nodded but didn't elaborate. After a long silence, she finally spoke. "Do you drive this route often?" "Not really," Eddie said. "First time, actually." Her face grew even paler. "You shouldn't be here." Eddie frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer, staring straight ahead. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing denser. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy now, and Eddie noticed something odd. The air inside the cab felt colder, despite the heater running full blast. "You all right?" Eddie asked, glancing at the woman. Her hands trembled as she pointed to the dashboard. "Do you see that?" Eddie followed her gaze. The clock, which had read 11:45 moments ago, now displayed 0. The radio crackled with static, though it had been off. "What the hell?" Eddie muttered, tapping the clock. A sudden, loud thump reverberated through the truck, followed by another, as if something heavy had landed on the roof. Eddie's grip tightened on the wheel. "Keep driving," the woman whispered. "I wasn't planning to stop," Eddie replied, trying to sound calm. The thumps grew louder, followed by a scraping noise that ran the length of the trailer. Eddie glanced in his side mirrors but saw nothing except darkness. "What's back there?" he asked, his voice unsteady. "Don't look," the woman said sharply. "It's not for you to see." Eddie's nerves were fraying. "Lady, what's going on?" Before she could answer, a deafening screech pierced the night, like metal grinding against metal. The truck shuddered, and Eddie struggled to keep it on the road. The woman leaned closer to him, her voice low but urgent. "Whatever happens, don't stop until you see the bridge." "What bridge?" "You'll know it when you see it," she said, her eyes locked on the road ahead. The scraping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. Eddie's heart pounded as he drove on, his eyes scanning the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, the road dipped into a valley. In the distance, he saw it, a rickety old bridge spanning a narrow river. The wooden planks gleamed faintly in the moonlight. "There," the woman said. "Drive across, but don't look back." Eddie did as she said, the truck rattling as it rolled onto the bridge. The planks creaked under the weight, and the river below shimmered like black glass. Halfway across, he felt it, a presence behind him, heavy and oppressive. The hairs on his neck stood up, but he kept his eyes forward, gripping the wheel tightly. The bridge seemed endless, stretching farther than it had looked from a distance. Eddie's chest tightened as whispers filled the cab, low and indistinct, like dozens of voices murmuring just out of earshot. "Almost there," the woman said, though her voice sounded distant now. Finally, the truck rolled off the bridge onto solid ground. The whispers ceased, and the air grew warmer. Eddie pulled over, his hands shaking as he turned to the woman. But she was gone. The passenger seat was empty, and the door hadn't opened. Eddie stared, his mind racing. Had she even been there? He looked back at the bridge. It was gone. The road stretched on behind him, unbroken, with no sign of the river. Eddie didn't wait to figure it out. He started the truck and drove straight to Dry Creek, arriving just as dawn broke. The dock worker loading his truck noticed Eddie's pale face. "Rough night?" "You could say that," Eddie replied, glancing back down the empty road. The worker chuckled. "You came in on Route 6, didn't you?" "Yeah, why?" The man's smile faded. "That road's been closed for years. Landslide took out the bridge in." Eddie didn't say anything. He just climbed into the cab and drove off, vowing never to take a shortcut again.